Seated in her office, Kathy pulled open her desk drawer to retrieve the thick stack of documents to have a look at them. Within the documents were photos of the exterior of her artifacts. Barely able to contain her excitement, Kathy said to Professor Walker, "Wow, never have I imagined that we could ever get the chance to work on an actual mummy, a being from centuries ago. This is so crazy." "Yeah, I never thought this would happen either," said Professor Walker, still fascinatedly looking at the artifact photos Kathy was holding on to. The day finally came. The coffin sat there in the middle of the lab as Professor Walker, Kathy, and Professor Taylor, a middle-aged man who was an external representative who sought help from Professor Walker and Kathy for the research project. They walked towards the coffin, which was about 3 feet in height and placed on a metal platform. The body was high above the ground that even though they were close and with the lid off, they still couldn't see the mummy. Once next to the coffin, they had to slightly tiptoe before finally getting a glimpse of the mummy's face. The mummy's face was not how Kathy imagined it to be. Before that day, Kathy thought to herself that it couldn't be much different from the ones she had seen on TV and on the internet, usually wrapped in partially broken bandages and parts of protruding bones and severely decomposed skin beneath it. Professor Walker and Kathy were completely stunned to see a woman, beautiful with her condition still showing no signs of decomposition, partially covered in what seemed like grass and sand. With the mummy looking like someone who was still alive and merely asleep, Professor Walker said, "This is incredible," while Kathy stood there with her jaw wide open. To interrupt the shock of the two scientists, Professor Taylor said, "Now, we need to find out what is this grass and sand made of that allowed this body to stay in this condition for centuries. And remember, no one else should know about this." Professor Taylor left shortly after as the two scientists excitedly began to work. For 18 hours each day for a couple of weeks, the two scientists worked tirelessly, trying to determine the source of the grass and sand. What was odd was that they looked like normal grass that you would find on a football field, and the sand is white and soft, just like the sand you would find at a beach resort. But somehow, the more the two of them worked on the project, the more they realized that the elements completely did not match with those usually found in grass and sand. As they got back to Professor Taylor with the findings, Professor Taylor got irritated. "So you guys wasted a couple of weeks of our time just to tell us that you can't figure out what it is?" said Professor Taylor, raising his voice. "We tried, but we couldn't make out the composition. This isn't exactly something we have worked on before," replied Kathy, sounding annoyed with Professor Taylor's attitude. "If you can't do it, fine. We'll take it back then," said Professor Taylor. "Sure, go ahead. I'll arrange for the transport to send the coffin back," said Kathy. After Professor Taylor immediately left, while still very annoyed, Professor Walker then asked Kathy, "Are you sure you want to do this? This is an opportunity of a lifetime to work on something like this. We can't give up yet." "Don't worry. I have never given up on something like this and never will. Before we give it back to them, we'll take some of the grass and sand and continue our own research," said Kathy. Knowing that they will work overnight at the lab as they had to return the coffin the next day, Professor Walker went back home for a little while to grab some of his things before coming back to the lab. Meanwhile, Kathy stayed and continued working. Late into the night and feeling exhausted, Kathy began to feel her eyes closing as she was taking samples from the coffin. Suddenly, Kathy saw the mummy's eyes blink a couple of times, as though someone was finally waking up from a long sleep. Kathy slightly shook herself and blinked a couple of times to regain her alertness and stared at the mummy again to see if the mummy indeed blinked. But Kathy no longer saw any motion, with the mummy looking as still as the stump of a tree. I must be that tired that I'm starting to see things. It's time for my espresso shots, I guess, said Kathy to herself. Kathy stepped out of the room and went down to the first floor to grab a cup of coffee from the vending machine near the building entrance. She saw the night-duty security officer and said, "Hey, Mr. Gerard, did you see our visitor, Professor Taylor, leave?" Nope, I only saw Professor Walker leave a couple of hours ago, but I haven't seen the other guy yet, though, said Mr. Gerard. That's weird. He was supposed to leave even before Professor Walker. Well, it's all right. Thanks, Mr. Gerard. I guess I'll be going back up to continue my work, said Kathy. No worries. Let me know if you need anything, said Mr. Gerard. Kathy nodded and walked back up to her lab. Just as she walked up to her floor, she suddenly felt an eeriness to the floor's aura. Something didn't feel right. Then, from afar, Kathy noticed her lab door ajar. She slowly peeked in and saw Professor Taylor near the coffin, with his back facing her. What she heard was as though Professor Taylor was chewing on the grass, and a hand motion seemingly stuffing sand into his mouth, with some of it missing his mouth and dropping onto the floor. Carefully entering the room and placing her coffee cup on a small table next to her, Kathy spoke softly. "Professor Taylor, what are you still doing here?" Kathy walked slowly towards Professor Taylor, and as she got close enough, Kathy tapped on his shoulders. Professor Taylor suddenly stopped what he was doing, stayed still, and dropped the remaining grass and sand he was holding onto. Suddenly, Professor Taylor turned around, stared at Kathy with eyes as red as fire and mouth full of grass and sand. Kathy immediately knew that Professor Taylor wasn't Professor Taylor. Professor Taylor aggressively grabbed Kathy by both arms and dragged her backwards. "Do you know that these were not hers to take? It was mine. She was a mere helper, and I took her in as my wife. I paid the witch pots of gold to help me create this so that I could live for eternity, but that stupid helper took it away from me for her own selfish greed. She died anyway, didn't she, that foolish young girl?" shouted whatever that was, screaming from within Professor Taylor's body. Kathy tried to scream but just couldn't let out any sound as she was completely petrified. All she could do was struggle hard to release herself from Professor Taylor's grip. Once she got herself out of the grip, Kathy pushed Professor Taylor backwards towards the coffin. Suddenly, sounds of grass and sand were heard grinding violently from within the coffin. To Kathy's horror, the woman in the coffin sat up swiftly with her hair and body still partially caught in grass and sand. Both the woman's hands reached out in a hugging motion and pulled Professor Taylor towards her and into the coffin. A petrified Kathy, who fell on her knees at the other end of the room, saw Professor Taylor struggling while being pulled. Sand and grass were spilling out of the coffin. Inch by inch, Professor Taylor was eventually completely pulled into the coffin, no longer in Kathy's view. After a few seconds, sounding as though two people were tussling on the beach, the sound of the sand eventually turned calm. Kathy looked around the room, lost, unsure what to do as her vision blurred. Suddenly, an image appeared in front of her, a familiar and comforting figure. It was Professor Walker. He had returned to the lab. Professor Walker, looking worried, immediately asked Kathy, "What's wrong, Kathy? What was all the sound I heard just now? Why are you on the floor? You look like you've seen a ghost. Kathy explained to Professor Walker what had happened earlier, while still trembling from the incident. Professor Walker looked into the coffin and saw nothing different. It was still the woman lying there alone, looking as peaceful as he had seen her earlier. Look at the mess you made, Kathy. There's so much of the sand and grass on the floor. All right, Kathy, I think you've overworked yourself. Let's get back to your office and get some rest first. Come on, let's go, said Professor Walker as he guided a trembling Kathy out of the room. The next day, to their surprise, a different professor in charge came to collect the coffin, along with his colleagues. Curious and still remembering how Professor Taylor was pulled into the coffin last night, Kathy asked, "Sorry, but where is Professor Taylor?" wanting to see how they would respond to her question. Stuttering and sounding hesitant, the man said, Professor Taylor is caught up in another matter." The man avoided further conversation as he seemed to be hiding something, collected the coffin, and left. Kathy looked at Professor Walker in a state of confusion, still unsure to this day what had actually happened. Did Kathy really see Professor Taylor possessed last night? Or was she too tired that she hallucinated everything? What happened to the real Professor Taylor? And why did Professor Taylor's colleagues seem to be hiding something? Did they know science had nothing to do with this but just gave it a shot? These were questions still stuck in Kathy's mind. A day at the office that she will never forget. How about you? Have you had such horrifying experiences at your workplace?